Welcome to the show. I'm going to read you something here from a website on the subject of psychotherapy. It's called A Note on How Psychotherapy Works. And believe it or not, I did not write this. This is not from my website. This is from our guest's website. Psychotherapy is rational and accessible. It is not some esoteric, undefinable, mystical process that only some people can grasp, a faith that only converts believe in and others do not. It is a logical process which anyone can understand and follow. There is no reason for anything in a session to be unreasonable or mysterious. On the contrary, in good psychotherapy, every step should make complete sense to you, the patient. You may end up in strange territory, but it should be entirely clear to you how you got there. These are the words of Dr. Bennett Polagy, a clinical psychologist who is joining us today. He is the author of a website that really could be a book and should be a book. It's called AboutPsychotherapy.com. Dr. Polagy, are you with us?
Yes.
I have to tell you, I was so impressed with your website when I stumbled upon it a couple weeks ago.
Thank you.
It's rare in my experience, especially when I'm looking at the subject of psychotherapy, to find an author who, as I'm reading what you write, what's running through my mind as to what should be the next logical statement, that's what you write. We think very much in the same terms. I couldn't have said this better myself in terms of that quote that I just read to you. Tell us a little bit about your background. I know you're a clinical psychologist. You're in the New York, Connecticut area. Is that right?
New York, yeah.
Now, how long have you been practicing, and what kind of clients or patients do you work with?
Well, over the years, I've seen just about every type there is. I grew up near New York City, and I chose to go to graduate school here, of all the possibilities, because of that, the exposure to such a wide range of people and psychological orientations.
Oh, I imagine so.
I started with kids, and I've worked in community mental health centers and in hospitals and state psychiatric hospitals and the VA, and I've worked with medical patients, and I've worked with all range of outpatients, children, adults, adolescents, senior citizens. So I've gotten a wonderful, wide experience. I've been doing it for about 12 years, 13 years.
Now, why do you say there is a need, as you say on your website, to demystify psychotherapy?
Gosh, a lot of reasons. A few of them have to do with the biases that all of us bring into this. I think people kind of clench up when they hear about emotional things, and we all sort of roll our eyes. And if you look at sitcoms, every sitcom has had at least one episode where the joke was the eccentric ministrations of some therapist.
So true.
And
so true.
And unfortunately, it is true. The other thing is, I don't think a lot of therapists explain that concept that you just read from the site. That when I say, "Gee, it sounds like you hate your mother," it's not coming out of the blue. There's a lot of steps that led up to that conclusion.
Right.
And that gets left out of descriptions of the process, and I think, unfortunately, therapists may leave it out of the process itself with the patient.
Now, how should a person go about choosing a therapist, or do you even like that idea of choosing a therapist? I know you touch on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical. That's a very important process. One thing that happens to people is, understandably, they're faced with, gee, I need to talk to somebody, and they're feeling fragile and vulnerable and uncertain. And it's very hard when you're in that state to listen to your own inner voice, listen to your own gut. But that's really the best guide. When you call up a therapist, you can get a sense right on the phone, is this someone that you feel comfortable with, that you feel you could warm up to? And if not, move on. So I think it's often a mistake, I think, to look at other things, to look at what kinds of books they've written, what kinds of, or websites they have, what kinds of courses they've taken, what kinds of teaching that they do. Those are all useful, but that's not going to help you in the moment-to-moment interaction with a therapist. Therapist has to be somebody that you can connect to.
Do you think I'm correct to assume that it helps and is crucial even to have a therapist who thinks along the lines that you do and works in a way that you're comfortable with theoretically, but there's also a personal connection there as well? Like you say, you can often get a sense of it just from the first phone call. Both of those characteristics need to be there, don't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. You're talking about, when you go to therapy, you're talking about all your most personal things. How could you
That's right.
do that with somebody that you're not comfortable with? As far as somebody thinking like you or having the same theoretical orientation, that I'm not so sure about. Often that's used as I guess you'd call it a smokescreen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to talk to that therapist, it's a woman, or that therapist is too old, or that therapist isn't a Jungian or a Freudian or a Adlerian or whatever.
Yeah.
And research and anecdotal evidence is all so clear that really what separates successful from unsuccessful therapy is the quality of the therapist, not the type.
Yeah.
Not the gender, not the age, nothing like that.
I see some of what you're saying because people have come to me sometimes who know a little bit about the different schools of psychotherapy, and sometimes they want or prefer a therapist who subscribes to a different school of thinking than I necessarily do, but they decide to give me a chance anyway. And in many of those cases, it's worked out fine because that personal kind of connection was there, even if theoretically we didn't agree on everything.
Absolutely. That's a very common experience for us who do this work and like it.
Tell me, Ben, what is a psychological symptom? How can the layperson define a psychological symptom? What should you look for?
Oh, there's a lengthy description of that on the website.
Yes, there is.
I think of a symptom. I don't know if this. You mentioned that the site should be a book. The site is a book. There's another, probably 50% more, and it was condensed into this website.
Are you going to make the book available sometime?
I'd love to.
Okay, good.
I don't know if this phrase made it from the book into the website, but I think of symptoms as defenses run amok. If you think, for example, come up with a very, very simple example. Someone who grows up in a very volatile, violent, unpredictable household and himself as a child maybe becomes a bully, impulsive, maybe gets labeled ADD along the way. And then somewhere along the line, and this happened to one of my patients, something clicks and he's able to stop and think. And that becomes his saving, something that saves him in life. He learns to stop and think so he doesn't get into fights. He doesn't lash out at teachers. He learns to be discreet around prospective employers, that sort of thing. However, that can develop into an obsessiveness, an inability to make decisions because you're so preoccupied and anxious about, well, wait a minute, did I think this through enough? And if you imagine that continuing and continuing, that's a person who might come into your office riddled with indecision and very much stuck and feeling that they can't decide even simple things. They don't know whether to go this way or that way, whether to go out with this girl or that girl, whether to change jobs or stay there, and even to the point of, I couldn't decide when I left the house whether I should stop at the supermarket or the hardware store first, and I was so panicked with indecision I couldn't get out, So it's kind of like a defense, this stop and think, that goes crazy.
So a defense, I've always thought of a defense in trying to explain it to people, a defense mechanism. I know that's a term that goes back to Freud. It's a self-protective measure that goes on in your mind but outside of your conscious awareness,
exactly.
Right?
That's an important phrase you just said, outside of conscious awareness.
Outside of conscious awareness.
Sometimes, if you ever watch a psychologist on a talk show, or any time that this process is made public in a clumsy way, it looks so silly. And the reason is because we don't appreciate, as we watch it, that these things happen unconsciously. Some person who's indecisive in the way I just described, you look at them and say, well, that's silly. What does it matter whether you go to the hardware store?
Yeah.
Well, because it didn't start from there. It started, as I described, from an unconscious maneuver to protect oneself.
I notice so many people that come to my office for counseling and therapy. Obviously, they're very aware of counseling and therapy, otherwise they wouldn't be there.
Right.
So there's more awareness, and I guess you could say accessibility to therapy today than there ever has been before. But there also is, to a very great extent, I find, a lot of trepidation and uncertainty and honest ignorance and confusion about what it really is. That's why websites or books like yours are so important.
Interesting, there aren't many of them.
No.
I know you have one.
I have a website, and my book, Effective Therapy, is designed to explain some of this in layman's terms. But other than my book and your site, I have found precious little.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder.
That's interesting. I think that has to do, actually, with money. It's very hard to sell a book like Effective Therapy. I'm sure you found that, as compared with something that says, stop depression in 5 easy steps.
Right. A lot of people don't approach the subject from the vantage point of, okay, well, what is therapy and how do I define it? But once people get to the point where they decide they want or have to see a therapist, then they're a little bit more interested. Of course, if they're in a crisis state, then they often want quick or overly simple answers, and that's not always realistic. But you were talking a minute ago about the television sitcoms and so forth, and the whole image of therapy. Of course, we have Woody Allen's humorous depictions of psychoanalysis, which is not the only kind of therapy, of course. But what are some of the common myths that you run into about therapy that people seem to have?
Interesting question, because they come in many layers. A person might profess one myth out loud, and then as you get to know them, you find that they hold an entirely other myth, equally incorrect, underneath. Sort of the most blatant example, I was on vacation once in the Caribbean and was on some sort of a bus tour, and a guy behind me started a conversation with me, asked me what I did. I said I'm a psychologist. He said, "Oh, I've got my opinions about that."
Yeah, I run into that too.
Yeah, that kind of automatic dismissal.
Uh-huh.
Now, on the surface, that might sound like, oh, I know what it is. It's all that quack stuff about blame your mother and father for everything that's wrong with you.
Uh-huh.
I actually got to know that guy a little bit because he came back later and kept starting up conversations about it. So clearly he wanted to talk about it. And what emerged as I talked to him was that he was actually very, very deferential, very afraid of psychology, of the whole idea, very concerned as he asked me. That he wanted to know things. He wanted to know, what does it mean when a person does this or feels that? But at the same time, he was very nervous. He didn't really want me to say too much, I could sense. And I don't know why. I didn't get to know him that much. And that's kind of an opposite myth, that psychologists, certainly analysts, will have all these wonderful answers to everything, which it isn't true. You can't, people with that myth often say, what does it mean when this happens?
Yeah.
Well, the answer depends on 1,000 other variables.
It's like this whole idea of the therapist as this mystical oracle who, out of the sky, gives you the answer and you walk away with it and everything is fine forever. See, in my book, I stress the need to reason and to use logic and to think for yourself, and the therapist is really a guide to help you do that.
Yeah.
To not say, do such and such, not, like Dear Abby or Dr. Laura, do as I say. That's not really what a good therapist does, in my view. A good therapist reasons with you and says, well, if your goal is such and such, then this is what you have to do. And then you can evaluate for yourself if you think that reasoning makes sense. And you talk on the homepage of your website about the need for logic and demystifying and so forth. Do you think, Ben, that there is a right and a wrong way to do therapy, or is it all subjective opinion? Or how do you...
I think there are some absolutes in there.
Okay. What are some of the ones that immediately spring to your mind?
Are you thinking of things that would make you say, time to change therapists?
Well, perhaps, yes. Yeah, the qualities that have to be there in good therapy. That's a
some of the more blatant things is you do not need to be involved in your therapist's life, and you should not be, even if you're tempted to. You don't need to go to the opera with him, or have a beer with him, or hear about his personal life unless he's saying something to illustrate something about your life. You certainly should run from any therapist who wants to have a sexual relationship with you or to date you. But to get to the more subtle things, therapy should not be an endless massage. If you're only being agreed with, that's not going to accomplish anything.
True.
It should not necessarily be this kind of unconditional acceptance with the absence of any challenge. You shouldn't always, if you're so comfortable that it's like sitting in a jacuzzi, I don't know what you're accomplishing. Therapy, on the other hand, as you said, is not advice. The world's full of advice. Often people who come to therapy have had so much advice that they've gotten confused. The problem is that they've lost track of their own best interests and what helps them think clearly and what decisions are best for them and how to implement them. And that's what they need to relearn.
Okay,
kind
Ben.
of like teach a man to fish as opposed to give him a fish.
Okay, Ben, very interesting. We're going to need to take a quick break here. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Solutions, Not Excuses, discussing psychotherapy. Welcome back to Solutions, Not Excuses. Dr. Ben Polagy. He is the author of the website AboutPsychotherapy.com. AboutPsychotherapy.com. That's a mouthful, but it's worth it. Ben, you were saying something very interesting before the break. You were talking about how therapy should not be an endless massage, and you started to get into the whole idea of unconditional positive regard, which I know some psychological theories talk about as being perhaps the essence of therapy or the essence of healing people. Could you tell us a few more of your thoughts about unconditional positive regard?
Sure.
It's not all it's cracked up to be, is what you seem to be saying.
No, I'd like to change that. It's not that it's not what it's cracked up to be. It's that term, like most psychological terms, once they get out of the seminar rooms, get distorted grossly. And the public, as you mentioned, people come in with myths, and that's one of them. Unconditional positive regard does not mean sitting with a patient and agreeing with everything. That's a satire of unconditional positive regard. So let's put the term aside, because one of the nice things about real psychotherapy is it should not have jargon in it. But what I was saying is that a session should not be just a massage, just comfortable. Sessions should stir you up a little bit. They should make you a little uncomfortable. Not all of them, not all the time. Because what you want from a therapist is to begin thinking about and looking at things that you haven't thought about and looked at before.
True.
And that's, of course, going to be a little uncomfortable. You want to break some habits. Just like if you're, trying to fix your golf swing, there's going to be a period of discomfort where you have to unlearn some of your bad muscular habits and train new ones.
I always think of it as like physical therapy, which most of us haven't been through, but many have been through. In order to get better, you do go through some discomfort and pain because you're retraining your body to act in the way it needs to act. With therapy, you're retraining or maybe really training your mind to function in the way that it's supposed to.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that you're not just retraining a golf swing, which you may have picked up when you were 15, 20, 30, 40. You're retraining stuff that you learned possibly as young as 1 or 2 years old.
Right.
I mean, it's deeply embedded into every cell of your body.
Yes.
That comes up against a resistance, that's the fancy word, much stronger than just your muscles rejecting a new way to swing a golf club.
And we were talking earlier about myths of therapy, and of course it still is a myth that therapists, well, it's an exaggeration or a satire that therapists blame everything on the mother, but it is a perception, a widely held perception, I think, that therapists do center on childhood. But speaking for myself, I'd like to see your take on this, but speaking for myself, I don't center on childhood. What I do is I recognize that what you just said is true, that we have deeply embedded feelings or viewpoints about ourselves and about life, viewpoints which can often be distorted. And those need to be brought up and challenged in the present so you can have better self-esteem or whatever.
Absolutely.
And that's really what it's about, right? Not just to talk about your childhood and relive it for the sake of reliving it.
That's an intellectual game. That's fake therapy.
That's right.
We need a whole show on this topic.
Oh, I know.
Anybody interested in this topic, please go look at my site because it's way too much to explain here.
Oh, absolutely.
But in a nutshell, a couple of points. One, I don't think anybody should be doing therapy to find who's to blame.
Right.
What happens is, what you need to find out in therapy is, who are you? How did you become who you are? How are you behaving in ways that are not consistent with the present, but in some way are reenacting something from the past? What is that stuff that you're reenacting? Not whose fault is it?
Right.
It may be nobody's fault. Maybe your fault. Maybe you're too sensitive, just like everybody always told you. It doesn't matter. The fact is that's what you do feel, and that's what you continue to enact. Even if you think it's silly,
Why are people's minds so quick to go to blame?
Oh, gosh. A lot of reasons. You're going to have to stop me if this gets too long.
I will. We have commercials.
One reason is that when you start to, let's say, for example, that in the example of the patient I gave before, the guy who grew up in a volatile, unpredictable, scary house, he has developed a personality, a series of defenses and now symptoms to try to cope with that and to try to avoid the horror and the pain and the scariness of it all from way back then. When you begin to talk about it, that person is going to find any way in the world, unconsciously, to avoid it, to deny it, to say it's not true, to say you don't know what you're talking about, to say, I don't want to blame anything. So that's one quick answer. Well, I don't want to blame everybody. I want to be self-reliant.
Yeah.
So I think that's one reason. It's in service of resisting the process, the exploration.
Do you think, Ben, that it's a good idea to try and decide at the beginning of therapy how long it's going to take, or is it something you have to do more one session at a time?
Well, certainly not one session at a time, because like going to the gym, you can't enjoy it every time. You have to do it on faith for a while, and then see if it makes you feel better.
Well, do you know a good number to start with? Is it good to tell people?
I know what I use. I tell people, assuming the first session goes well and they want to come back, I say, okay, come back 4 more times. And your half of the bargain in that 4 or 5 sessions is not to obsess about, is it working? Does this guy know what he's doing? Do I like this? Is it going to help? Just come.
Right.
Put the time and money aside to show up. And again, I use the analogy of the gym. You don't rush to the mirror after 2 visits and see if your muscles are bigger. By the end of those 5 sessions, we should all have a very clear idea that we're going somewhere, that we're not just rehashing conversations you've had 100 times with other people, that something is beginning to be interesting, that you're talking or beginning to think about things that you haven't before or in a way you haven't before. Something's moving.
Okay, aboutpsychotherapy.com is the website. Dr. Ben Pology, psychologist, is our guest. Psychologist and psychotherapist. We'll be right back with more Solutions, Not Excuses. Stay with us. Our guest is psychologist Dr. Ben Pology. We're discussing psychotherapy and the website, a wonderful website, very user-friendly, very easy to navigate and get around, aboutpsychotherapy.com. Did you design this website yourself, Ben?
Yeah.
It's really, really easy to get around.
Thank you.
Very, very good. It's an excellent resource for just figuring out what therapy is. And it's not all theoretical either, like we're talking about. You have lots of case studies integrated into the ideas and the theories that you put forth, and it's very much in layman's terms.
And I hope people click on them. You can only get to the websites from the pages, you can only get to the case examples from the pages of the web. And I was looking over them today. I hadn't seen them in a while. And there's a lot of important material in there. It's not just the story of that particular case. I may even have to rewrite some of this to get it more in the front.
Yeah. Well, you get a lot of nitty-gritty detail in there that can answer a lot of questions for people that are just trying to figure out what in the world is therapy, because it is such a mystical thing in people's minds.
It's a hard process to define. It's not just for the public. You know, those of us who go to school and study it, it's hard to put into words.
What do you think of this movement towards personal coaching? Are you familiar with that?
Very little. I have a patient, actually, who's a psychologist and works with businesses. And that's been around for a while, and I think it's in that direction.
Yeah.
It's not psychotherapy. It certainly won't hurt you.
What do you think the essential difference is between personal coaching and therapy, as you understand it?
Okay, well, again, I'm speaking now as the guy who doesn't know a lot about it. My understanding of it is that it does not dig into who you are, how you function, and what you really feel, and what you're doing that might be unconscious.
I think it's very focused on, let's come up with an action plan, get moving, stay with it, stay with the program.
Sure. I think it's educational. In other words, here's things that, for example, I would meet somebody as a coach and say, I see this strength in this one. Here's something that you haven't tried, that you're neglecting. And maybe they go so far as to say, it's something you're neglecting and you may not realize it, but look at the effect this might have on people that you're dealing with, and you don't want to have that effect, you want to have the other effect, so have you tried this?
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think that's psychotherapy.
Now, you state on your site that medication is not a substitute. Medication, while sometimes valuable, psychiatric medication, Prozac and so forth, while sometimes valuable, is not a substitute for psychotherapy, which is identical to what I always say. Could you explain that?
Sure, but I'd like to add that I think medication is sometimes necessary.
Yes.
I am not at all anti-medication. Yeah, gosh, there's an example of a man, actually my first patient ever. I was in the state hospital in my second year of graduate training. Now, this was a guy on enough medication to put an elephant to sleep for a week, and yet he still walked around with a lot of physical tension.
Wow.
Clearly he needed the medication or he was completely crazy and out of control. With the medication, however, he was able to do the same kinds of discoveries that we see in outpatients in our private practices, and he became less what we would call crazy. Mm-hmm. For example, early in treatment, he talked about being so tense, and I asked him at one point what would happen if he relaxed, and he said, buildings would come crashing in, fires would erupt, volcanoes.
Wow.
Now, that's kind of crazy, you know.
Yeah.
If I relax, you know, things will happen in the universe. We never talked about this, but 8 months later, when I finished up with him, the same issue came up. What if you relaxed? And he said, I'd bang my head, I'd go crazy, I'd break things. Now, that's not crazy.
Right.
That's, if I relax, I will lose control. That's quite a common.
That's getting to the real issue.
Now, his medication didn't change in those 8 months. All that happened was that the medication he had been on was bringing him enough calm that he was accessible to psychotherapy. And you see that in outpatients. There's a lot of patients who can't go through the process without the help of some medication.
Was he able to get off of, or at least lower the dose of the medication at some point? Do you know?
No. This was a guy. I mean, again, I'll give you the numbers. He was taking 60 milligrams a day of a medication that if you and I took 2, we would probably sleep for 24 hours. I mean, that's the degree of tension he had in him.
Right.
It's a guy with real problems.
Yeah.
There are many patients in my private practice, though, who go on medication for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then they don't need it anymore.
That's more often the norm, I think, with most people.
And speaking of myths, a lot of people worry that if they get on the medication, they're going to need it forever, they're going to be addicted.
That's the most common worry that I find in people.
Or another one, the side effects, I hate them, it doesn't really help. And I can tell you from the patients I've worked with and from friends and people I know, when you hit the right medication, the feeling is so clear that all your previous misconceptions about, I'm not going to like the side effects, they just disappear immediately. You go, oh, my goodness, That's right. That's what life's supposed to feel like.
Now, I know this is another huge subject, and people can go to your website for much more detail, but can you talk briefly about what personality is? We all use that term, but what is it really?
Well, I can give you my take on it.
Yes, that's what we want.
Well, you remember we were talking about what is a symptom and what is a defense.
Mm-hmm.
And I alluded to the fact that defenses start because when you're very young, some situation is not something that you can't cope with. Little children can't cope with the things that we grown-ups can. So you develop a defense, a way of handling it. The guy I mentioned developed this stop-and-think defense. That's really where the personality starts. Personality is the combination of your genetic predisposition. You may be a high-anxiety person, a low-anxiety person, high-energy, low-energy, gregarious, withdrawn, shy. The mix of those basic elements combined with your particular way of coping with whatever your environment was as you grew up.
So it's a combination of our physiology, our genes, our psychology, our subconscious defense mechanisms, our conscious ideas, our conscious beliefs.
I would put the latter two as the least important.
Really?
Sure. I think that personality, when we sort of talk about it casually, has to do with things that we're less conscious of.
Yes.
Basic attitudes that people sense in us and therefore respond to us. Less so what we say or what we like to believe about ourselves. When I was younger, I used to think I was a very timid soul. And gradually, over the course of experience, where I was sort of thrown into situations, I discovered that when I'm not thinking about it, that's absolutely not true. When I'm suddenly thrown into any kind of a crisis or when there's something I want, it's not true. And yet all my life I thought I was. So I think that our conscious attitudes are often not as central to who we really are.
Yeah, I agree with you psychologically speaking. I think that the conscious ideas that one adopts are very important, but really they're not worth a hill of beans if you're emotionally held.
You bet.
Subconsciously held beliefs conflict because your deepest emotions, I think, tell you who you really are. Whether you like or agree with those emotions or not, whether they're arguably rational or not, isn't the point. That's who you really are. But that leads to my next question. Can one change one's personality in a sweeping way? Obviously not overnight. But in a longer-term sense, can one change one's personality? Have you ever seen it happen?
Depends what you mean by change a personality. Here's what I think the process of psychotherapy is. And I'm not the first to say this, I think Freud was, making what's not conscious, conscious, becoming more aware, expanding your awareness, which is why the word shrink is so silly. So it's not so much that you change your deepest personality. You become more aware of it, and then you develop entirely different ways of expressing it and coping with it. And to the outside, that may look like a lot of difference or a little difference, depending on how closely people are looking. You touched on something very important when you said what we consciously believe may not be worth a hill of beans if what's unconscious conflicts with that.
Right.
And that is guaranteed what will happen in any successful psychotherapy. Not all, but a lot of the cases in my website, if you look at them, you'll see examples of somebody coming in and saying, this is what I want and this is what I believe. And very quickly, the therapy uncovers the fact that even though that's what they want, they fight it tooth and nail, and that they believe something quite opposite.
Now, you also talk about children and adolescents and therapy, too. And again, the portions that I had a chance to read were 100% in line with what I had encountered. Children and adolescents are not generally the most motivated people for counseling and therapy. But today I find that parents are very motivated to get their kids in to, quote, get help. But, of course, as you point out on your website, if a therapist is to help a younger person, it's going to take more time because it takes many, many sessions just to get them to warm up to you, and there's no guarantee of success.
Sure. Sometimes, yeah.
Now, you have the case example of Claire, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
Claire, if you remember her, she was
very well
confused. Yeah, she was confused in part because her parents only spoke about her in positive terms. I guess they were trying to, quote, build her self-esteem, but she was confused. And you were more blunt and direct with her, not mean, but just more honest with her, including about her negative traits, and that was therapeutic for her. Am I right?
Very, and we should point out that to the audience that Claire was a girl with various neurologic deficits, including blindness.
Oh, my.
And she had the problem was she was having a very hard time keeping up with even the blind children because of her deficits with balance and orienting space. And as a matter of fact, you mentioned what I said wasn't mean, but to the staff, they were appalled at what I said to her.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought it was gentle.
Huh? What happened was she was very confused because she couldn't keep up in the physical education in class. and she was feeling terrible and confused and crazy because when she spoke to her parents, they very understandably said, "Oh, but darling, you're good at this and you're good at that and you're good at things." And they didn't want to dwell on the negative.
Yeah.
Understandably, they want to make her feel better. Trouble is, it made her feel crazy,
Yeah.
I can't do these things. It makes me feel bad, but I'm not supposed to talk about it. So one day she was talking about these difficulties, some specific things she couldn't do, and I said, "Well, of course you can't do that. Your brain has a problem with that. We know that." And she looked at me very shocked for a minute and then relaxed and was much calmer that day and pretty much from then on. Now that kind of miracle moment doesn't always happen. But it's interesting. She retold that story to some of the teachers in this special education program I was working in, and a couple of them really went up in arms. How dare I speak to a kid that way? And that happens with parents. They do want help, and they even with the results, sometimes they'll get very angry.
Well, there's so much more I could say and ask, but I'm going to have to take a pause here for another break. AboutPsychotherapy.com is the website. Dr. Ben Pology is our guest. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Solutions, Not Excuses. Welcome back to Solutions, Not Excuses. We are talking here today with Dr. Ben Pology about psychotherapy, and that's the title of his website, AboutPsychotherapy.com. During the break, Ben, you told me that there are two ways listeners can reach you if they're interested. One is obviously the website, but also your specific email address is bpology, that's BPOLOGE at AOL.com.
Mm-hmm.
And your phone number in the New York area is 212-774-9499.
Mm-hmm. We should mention that About Psychotherapy is a single word, no hyphens, no underlines.
That's right, yes, thank you. About Psychotherapy, all one word, .com. And there's so much more we could talk about. We could do 3-4 hours of shows here. Hopefully you'll come back sometime and go into this further with us, because this is so fascinating. I'm trying to decide what to ask you here while I still have you. We were talking about personality before the break. I know, or at least I gather, you do couples and family therapy as well as individual therapy. So you've seen couples. Like
a lot of couples, actually.
Yeah, and I don't know what your experience has been, but a common issue that I find, perhaps the most common issue, is spouses often want to change their other spouses. It's one of those things in the intellect. Virtually everyone will say, "Oh, no, I know you can't change somebody," in the intellect.
There you go.
On the subconscious, on the emotional level, you don't have to scratch that deep to see the opposite. Is that what you're finding, too?
I find that, and I find many other... what you're talking about is basic psychotherapy, whether it's with a couple or an individual, is uncovering what's really motivating behavior. And even what really the behavior is. A person may say, "I don't want to change them," but all of their behavior is such that is clearly showing that they do want to change their spouse. And the spouse will tell you that, and you can see it.
So what do you do as a therapist? You just confront them with that fact?
Well, gosh, that's the art. That's the art of, your relationship with the person, your particular style.
It is.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, you have to open their eyes to it. That's what all therapy is about.
In some form.
How you do that is...
How will depend on a lot of different factors. Your rapport.
One thing I do with couples, which as I hear about couples therapy, I think is not made explicit to couples, unfortunately, is that the role in the therapy, as in the relationship itself, is simply this, and this may sound a bit simplistic, but it's not. Communication. Relationships are not about anything else.
True.
One person's mild sacrifice to wash the dishes at night might be the other person's nightmare. They can't abide the dishes. So you can't make it about these compromises, what's fair. No, it's about the communication.
Right.
Some couples are extremely old world, and the wife does all the traditional old wife things, even though she's working, and the husband lays about and watches the tube. But that's okay for them.
Right.
Because in their relationship, in their communication, that's what they want.
Right.
So the goal for me has always been restoring the communication. Once that's done, everything else will follow. The other thing I'd like to point out, as I say in the website, is couples have a terrible habit of waiting way too long before they consult a therapist. After years and years of resentments and animosities have built up so that they can barely sit in the same room together.
Oh, you're so right. I can't tell you the number of times a couple has come to my office and said that we were on our way to the attorney's office, but we thought we'd give therapy a chance. Really?
Right.
I mean, more than half the time, that's how it is. And prevention is always important in medicine or mental health as well, but it's really important with relationships.
And one other point about that, and this relates to individual therapy too. When a couple comes to see you and decides to break up, that's not failed therapy at all. That may be by far the best decision for both of them, for the kids, for everything. The therapy may have been a process of helping them come to that decision. Maybe they were stuck in the arguing, the bickering, and unable to make a decision. It's not failed therapy to say that, well, we learned that we don't really want to be together, we don't belong together, it's not working. And we learned to make that decision and take the steps to implement it rather than stay in something that's miserable and unhealthy.
I agree with you entirely. Some clients have even come to me, some couples have even come to me knowing that they're going to break up or they're likely going to break up, but they just want to try and sort out what went wrong so they can move on and do better in future relationships.
That's a wonderful reason to go to therapy, I think, so that you don't make the same mistake with the next person you meet.
That's right. And many will go individually as well.
I still get calls from, it's interesting, both sides of a couple that came to see me, and they couldn't sit in the room together. I saw them separately for a while, then together. Eventually they broke up, and it was very painful. This is 4 years ago now. I still get a call from each of them about once a year, just sort of leaving a message telling me where they are and what they're doing. One of them's remarried. And thanking me, even though the sessions were brutal.
Right.
And we all had a miserable time. And I used to sit there and think, man, I don't know how to do this work.
Why were they brutal? Did you have to confront them with a lot?
Again, the degree of animosity and hostility that had built up was so intense that they couldn't sit in a room together. And also, both of them, but the man in particular, was really not at all able to talk about these kinds of things, to sit in a room and listen and feel angry but not vent it. So they were very kind of noisy, angry sessions. But somehow, in all of that venting, the truth came out for both of them. Their eyes, they would go home. They would come and tell me this in the subsequent week, for example, that they left angry and not talking to each other. But somehow that opened the door so that during the week they were a little more civil to each other, and each was a little calmer and able to realize that, hey, the truth is, I felt like this almost for the full 7 years we were married. 7 years we were together. They were only married 3 years. And that's not a good track record. I don't think we were right in the first place.
Well, Dr. Ben Polagy, you have been a fantastic guest, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And again, I refer our listeners to your wonderful website, aboutpsychotherapy.com, and hopefully you'll come back again sometime soon because there's a lot more we could talk about. I think I got to about a third of my questions.
Sure, anytime.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Solutions, Not Excuses.